Thanks for coming tonight. So my name's Peter Felfer. I'm a professor of material science at the FAU. I think a lot of you might have attended this university since it's the largest local university. And I'm from the material science department. In my background, I come from classical material science like metallurgy, steels, aluminium, titanium, that kind of stuff. And I'm specialized in characterization, which means we have a lot of data that we produce from materials, and we do stuff with that, but that's not what I'm talking about today. Today I'm actually talking about how to make knowledge usable. And the reason for that is that the field I'm in has existed for a very long time. And it's a relatively broad field, so there is thousands and thousands or hundreds of thousands of publications that you theoretically are supposed to know, which obviously nobody can read 100,000 papers, it's unrealistic. And so the question is, can we make all of that accessible for us through AI, and how to do that? And I mean, Lucas already said it, and I think most of you already think probably it's going to be something along the lines of retrieval-augmented generation, RAG. And this is actually what I'm going to talk about today. But I want to give you a little bit, because a little bit of an intro. As Lucas already mentioned that he doesn't necessarily know what it is that I do. But this was just skipping one slide. So essentially what we do is atom probe tomography, which is a technique whereby we take materials, we take them apart atom by atom, and we put them back together in 3 dimensions in the computer. Right? This is the very quick rundown. And for that, coding is a central part of the scientific throughput, because we code a lot of analysis tools, we code a lot of hardware. Actually, my PhD student Merpat is here, who's done a lot of the hardware control system coding. And these are all instruments that are very expensive in acquisition. So we're talking about 10 million euros, roughly everything together in lab equipment, and it's equally expensive to run. So when you go and ask the German Science Foundation that you want money from them to run your lab, then you better have a good reason why you do that research. For us, it's therefore imperative that we know the literature well. And because the literature is so large, it's virtually impossible for us to really know all of it. And we want to be able to bounce our ideas off of the existing corpus of literature. And we want to be able to just directly work with that. And so essentially what we want to do is... No, that's the wrong one. What we want to be able to do is we want to improve evidence gathering before committing experimental resources. So essentially checking, has someone done that maybe 50 years ago already, and we already know what the result should be. And it allows us also to have better problem selection, so that we also identify really where the gaps in the literature are. And if you have thousands and thousands of papers, that's not as trivial as it sounds. Yeah, the rest is just a bunch of fancy pictures from equipment and my research group. Even though this image is already a little bit older, the newer ones weren't quite as nice. And this is one of the instruments, for example, that we've built ourselves, that I've designed, that we've built. But we also have commercial instrumentation. This is another instrument we've recently built. But this is maybe not as important for today. So in our workflow, where do we use AI? So especially starting with, I would say, the GPT-5 series of models, when coding really took off, and also in the last couple of months with command line tools becoming a lot more powerful. There's a lot of areas where we've really started using it a lot. The first one is a pretty obvious one, which is agentic coding. So a lot of the analysis algorithms that we have been developed over the course of 10, 15 plus years, exist in various states of documentation and various states of integration into current systems. And agentic coding really allows us to do very quick software migration, and also to work with the hardware control stacks in a very direct way, because hardware control is addressing and timing, right, and looking stuff up, and this is something that agentic coding can do very well. AI-assisted teaching, very important, very much also cuts into what I'm talking about today. So by now, the way that it works is that I record all of my lectures. I've done that since 2019 already, in the anticipation that today's tools are going to be available, and then I can just run a speech-to-text and use that to build lecture scripts. And I just wanted to show a quick example. So this is an example from a lecture about mechanical properties of materials. And so I give the lecture throughout the year. And then from the speech to text, I extract everything that's been talked about. And then essentially I have a CLI tool build a LaTeX document from all of that, which contains all the formula, everything nicely explained and nicely formatted, and that's then handed out to the students, and then they have a lecture script that is exactly the content of the lecture as it was given in any given year. Of course, next step in this case is also pulling information out from textbooks, but again, this is what Greg does, right? AI-supported administration. So if you work at a university, things that are in short supply is manpower, and especially administrative manpower. And also the administrative manpower is very often used in trivial tasks, like answering emails like when is course X, or when does this happen and that happen. And these are things that actually can be automated pretty well. Or don't underestimate it. If you're a professor, you're going to spend a lot of time trying to coordinate other professors and get appointments or get appointments where there's like a whole bunch of a committee that you're in, and organizing a lot of professors is very hard in this case because everyone's got a full schedule. And even scheduling tools are not that helpful because you have to offer people a lot of dates. So now what I've done, for example, is implemented an MCP server for my calendar that I can run through the university's LLM inference supply. And then it can automatically write back to the emails and say, hey, this day doesn't work, this day does work, stuff like that. But even more important is AI-driven knowledge utilization over large scientific literature. This comprises both openly or semi-openly available literature. I'll talk about it a little bit later, why today's publishing model is considered broken by many people. So there's sort of the lockout, closed knowledge problem. But on top of that, there's a lot of scientific literature that is not utilized at all. So we are an institute that has been existing for over 60 years. And you can imagine we've got a lot of master theses, PhD theses from years past that are nowhere accessible, that they're accessible in no repository in any way, shape, or form. So if you can digitize them and make them searchable, make them usable, then you can also incorporate a lot of work that otherwise would go completely overlooked into the utilization of the AI pipeline. So this is just a couple of things that we've done in my group. So this is instrumentation. So in my group, we're the only group in this area that has a full open source stack end to end. So from open hardware instrumentation all the way to open analysis software. This is published in a variety of different papers and also available through GitHub, either through my repositories or Mehrpart's repository in the case of the control systems. So anyone can, in principle, replicate what we do, which is something I value very much. And I can't get away without at least one data set. So this is one that we're very proud of. So this is actually the first measurement of hydrogen, in this case in the form of deuterium, in a solid material at a defined chemical potential. So in this case, high pressure deuterium. And what you see here is Each of those dots is exactly one atom, and the whole thing is about 40 nanometers wide. 40 nanometers is roughly, to give you an idea, is roughly 200 atoms across. No, 2,000 atoms, sorry. 2,000 atoms across. And there are two different phases in there, so there are two different types of solid crystalline phases in there, and one takes up hydrogen more than the other. And with this, we can then directly show where the hydrogen is and how much it is, how much of it there is. But let's get to the actual RAG pipeline that I want to talk about today. And essentially, it's supposed to be an end-to-end scientific knowledge pipeline. So if everything goes well, the end user will never know any of the effort that goes in, but they will just ask a question to the RAG system and hopefully get an answer that is correct, first of all. But correct is in science not enough. It's not enough to be correct. You actually have to be able to prove why you're correct. And this is the big difference maybe to a lot of other fields. In engineering, if something works, it works. It's not good enough in science. In science, you also have to know why it works and where the information came from. And this was built in a material science, atom probe, hydrogen context, but it's generalizable, especially for scientific applications. And the focus is the architecture, the constraints, the engineering solutions, and the scientific use cases. At the end, we can have a little bit of fun and actually ask the oracle that we've built to give us some answers. And the goal is evidence-based literature access at scale, so that for every single piece of information, so every time we have any piece of information in science, we need to be able to prove where it came from. And this is why this is so important for us. And not the chatbot wrapper. The chatbot doesn't know where it's got the information from. It can't tell you why it knows something. And for us, it's imperative that you know where the information comes from. And the current state in this case is, the first tricky one is with publisher silos. So we have a bunch of different publishers that own the IP rights, that own the content. Access to the content typically is very expensive. So the university pays hundreds of thousands of euros a year to access those scientific library databases. The morality of that is obviously questionable, but that's how it is. Usually the only way that you can access it in a permanent way is also through PDF, which is not a great database format, that's what we have. And a lot of the PDFs, just imagine that you get a paper from the early days of quantum physics in the 1920s. Obviously, that's not a nicely formatted PDF with embedded text. So you have to do some OCR and stuff like that. And it's not in a very good machine structure, and there's no provenance chain. So the target state is that we have one corpus, so that everything is in one place, of course. We have a structured representation. We have retrieval-ready metadata, so that every data point that we have in the end also has all the metadata associated, very, very important. And it's auditable grounding, which means that whenever we have any piece of information in the final output, we can go in, we can see which scientific papers actually produce that piece of information, as everything is fully traceable. And I think this is also pretty generalizable for a lot of applications. I'm thinking about if you're at a large corporation here in the Nürnberg area that has been operating for a very, very long time, then there's probably a lot of internal documents where you would have the exact same problems. I would imagine if you're at Siemens and someone pulls something out about cathode ray tubes from the 1920s, then it's probably also not a nicely formatted PDF. Good. Why is this so especially valuable in material science? Well, the literature is large, heterogeneously, and historically very deep. I would estimate that the core corpus of scientific literature that is relevant for my institute would be about 100 to 200,000 papers, somewhere in that order of magnitude. Then a lot of the scientific results or a lot of the insights that you get are strongly dependent on composition, process route, microstructure, and test conditions. So there's a lot of literature, but every piece of literature is highly specific, very, very highly specific. So there's no grand plan where someone said, okay, we're going to do 100 papers on X, and everyone does a coordinated look onto some specific property. So you essentially have a lot of scattered results on different materials that you need to use to make sense of. And the results are often not directly comparable without close reading. So you really have to look into it, what the actual experimental conditions were, what they exactly did, what instrumentation they used, at what time that instrumentation was used, and so on. And there's a very high value in there in identifying where agreements and disagreements are, and not just watch how the consensus evolved over the years, but also look at things that don't really agree with what the current consensus really is. And this really helps us to triage what we want to do in the end, so to prioritize. And really allocate experimental time, very expensive experimental time, much better. And experimental categories that we are working with is we have something I can show you later, for example, where we work with hydrogen trapping, diffusion, and so on, where we have about 15,000 papers that are published in that area. And in our RAG system, we have about 5,000 papers now that are accessible. Then if it gets a little bit more specialized, like the technique that I'm working with, atom probe tomography, if you look at the actual technical papers about it, you have about 700 roughly, that order of magnitude. Or you might have a very specialized question, like what happens if I change the laser wavelength or if I change the temperature or whatever, and then the corpus might get much smaller. Yeah, so this is sort of the levels that we're working with. Of course, you might be in a field like solar cells, where there might be even maybe 100,000 papers on something. Yeah. But yeah, and if you look at the different shapes the papers are in, this is just some examples. I don't expect you to be able to read it, but just that you can get an idea of what the different papers look like. So this is if you freshly download a current paper, it might look like this, it might look like this, it might look like this. Anyone that's ever tried native text extraction on a PDF already knows they're all going to come out in a different way, probably not well formatted. And we might even have papers like these. So this is a paper that's been scanned by someone probably in the 90s. It has some handwritten stuff on it, but it's nicely machine written. It's nicely typewriter written. Pretty nice for OCR, by the way. Or you might have something like this, scanned in journal with some distortions and so on. And it's also in a foreign language, at least for most people. For us, maybe not. So you might have a translation layer on top. Okay, so why is standard search not enough? So if you actually go and pay all those hundreds of thousands of euros to scientific publishers, the way you access the papers is usually through a search tool. And the search tool usually, or up to now, only consisted of either keyword searches, or if we were lucky, maybe a BM25 type semantic search. So something very, very basic. Which means if you have things that can be expressed in various different ways, you're already pretty much out of luck. Also, claims or how things were expressed changed over time. Claims can appear similar, while even though the papers were different. So you go by title, but then it turns out actually what they meant by the title was very different. But then eventually, if you want to get an overview, so you can see each paper being sort of like a tree in a forest, and you have to look at all the trees before you can see the forest. But occasionally you get review papers where someone's done the work for you and summed up all the literature. Problem with those is they're selective. The review papers that I've seen with the most citations might have a couple hundred citations, but I've never seen anything really beyond 1,000 citations. So this is selective, so the person that wrote it already picked some literature for one reason or another. Maybe they had a good reason, maybe they had not so good reason. And they're also pretty slow to update. So it takes a very long time to write a review paper. So maybe in your field, the last really good review paper is a couple of years old. And if a lot of stuff has happened, it's not going to be up to date. Also, the comparisons are normally very qualitative, but you might want to have a more evidence-based and more structured comparison. And you want to have a structured synthesis and not just an automatic truth extraction. And so what we can change with AI is we can go from lexicographic access towards semantic access. I mean, you can also do that just with a semantic database, obviously. But if you can write the semantic searches also automated, that speeds up stuff by a lot. And I'll show you by the end, hopefully. You can traverse large bodies of data to identify agreements, disagreements, and research gaps. Very important. And identify where we best invest our resources. And here on the right side, this is an example of a report like that. So essentially, it's a review paper that I've automatically generated using, in this case, either Codex or Claude code. I forgot one of the two, and had it go through the data. Through the database, automatic, also write its own search. So it writes its own semantic search, pulls the papers, the summaries, and then writes in this case, a review of the historic development of field evaporation theory. So essentially, theory about how atoms become ions. Now, that's maybe not that important, but it's a very specific question that you're not going to find a paper on, or a review paper, or anyone explaining it to you. And you can ask those questions then. Okay, so the question is, what must the system do end to end? Well, the first thing is we need to discover the relevant literature, which sounds trivial, but this is actually one of the most important steps. We need to know in the first place what literature we need to prioritize and we need to get. Because we can't go to a publisher and say, hey, why don't you just give us all of your data? They are not going to do that, because this is obviously their business model. We need to collect the papers across the fragmented publisher ecosystem, and you'll see later that this is actually the most exhausting part of the work, actually getting the papers. We need to normalize the PDFs and get them machine usable. So text extraction, OCR. Actually, by now, my personal opinion is OCR is better than native text extraction because the models have become pretty good. We need to build a searchable representation, and in this case, multi-tiered representation, because we want to be able to cross-compare. And of course, if you want to use an LLM to do that, it will have a context window. And context window sizes, when you get to data sizes of thousands and thousands of papers, you can't fit all of them into a context window. It's just so you have to prioritize, you have to have tiers that you work with and work your way from sort of an overview down. Then, in this case, expose the retrieval to coding agents. So over the last year, there's been a couple of evolutions. I started out just using N8N, and do some re-ranking and that kind of stuff. But it turns out, especially in the last 2 months or so, just let the coding agent have at it. And it will do a much better job, actually, than anything that you manually do. And then it will return the evidence, not just the text. The text that you get, if you ask the same questions to just a normal LLM, will not be able to tell you why the LLM knows that or where it got the information from, and you have no idea of knowing what's true or not. And especially in material science, if you look at publicly available data, a lot of the publicly available data is, let's say, marketing by companies. So I wouldn't trust an LLM that scraped the internet for information that comes from various manufacturers over the actual scientific literature. The success in the end, what are the criteria? We want to have a high coverage, so DOI. Yes, probably most of you know what a DOI is, digital object identifier. So essentially we want a high coverage of the literature base. We want to have a robust ingestion pipelines for PDFs of all quality levels. The oldest PDF, the oldest document that I have in there is from the mid-1800s. And it goes, of course, all the way up to current times. And we want retrieval that also surfaces canonical and overlooked papers, so that we don't just take the papers that everyone knows, but we also want to see the blind spots. And we want auditable provenance and reproducible outputs, of course. So in the end, we need to script as much as we can and give the rest to the LLM to figure out. So to be sort of semi-deterministic, and I'll show you later what I mean by that. Okay, so what are the 5 stages of the pipeline? So the first stage that we have is the stage that we need to know which papers we need to have in the first place. This is done by, I'll talk about it in a little bit more detail later on, by a literature discovery and expansion system where you use metadata repositories that are publicly accessible to build up a graph of the citation network, so how the papers are connected. And with those connections, you can actually find a list of the papers that you should have, need to have. Then you can filter. You can then use all kinds of filters. If you have more metadata, like abstracts and so on, then you can use a little bit of AI to do that as well. But generally, you build up a bird's eye view of the literature that exists, that might be relevant, might not be relevant, but that exists. Then comes the acquisition process, which is the hard work. The stage 3 is ingestion into the database with the metadata, OCR, chunking, summaries, embeddings, and so on. And then have the retrieval and ranking. In my case, there's a mixture of semantic, lexical, metadata, trigraphs, and so on. So you can do different weighing. And in the end, all of that should be usable via MCP tools. So it should be able to be used by an LLM directly without your intervention. Which also means you can close the agentic literature workflow. So you have a question, you retrieve the literature from that. You synthesize an overview. You have the agent critique its own product, so it goes through it and compares what it's written to what's in the database again, refines and can requery. And you can actually have that loop run until you run out of your token allowance. And this is typically what happens. So here on the right side, it's just a screenshot from Claude Code doing that. So in this case, what I've told Claude Code to do is to write a review of a certain topic that I'm interested in. And it's found out that there are 10 subtopics it could divide it up into. And then it just spun up into 10 different sub-agents. Each sub-agent then works on one specific topic and gives you a review of the topic. And then the master agent puts it back together and gives you the entire review with everything cross-referenced. But if you see 10 agents spin up in Claude Code, the next thing you think is probably, I'm going to run out of tokens, and that is usually what happens. Yeah? Okay, so the first thing is the literature expansion. So the question is, how do I get to the literature and how do I prioritize? Yeah? Because, of course, I can say this is something that's very important to me, and there are 15,000 papers, and then we go out and get every single one of those papers. Yeah? But there's going to be a lot of papers that are maybe not as relevant, or papers that are not that high quality. So the question is, how do I find which ones are the most important ones? And typically in science, the way we do that is by citation count. So every time you write a scientific paper, you have to reference every scientific paper whose knowledge you use to generate that new paper. Yeah? And these are usually pretty well represented in databases, and they're openly accessible databases like OpenAlex and Crossref, where you can just poll for a specific DOI, and then you get all the DOIs that are citing this paper or cited by that paper. And so the way that I do that is I start from trusted seed papers. So I go into, or I hopefully know a little bit about that field. And so I get the papers that are most influential in that field, kind of defining that field. And then what we do is we poll all the papers that are citing these papers, because this is sort of our motion forward in time, so everything that happened afterwards. And we're polling all the papers that have been cited by those papers, so that's our motion back in time, so towards all the papers. And you can think of that as in like an hourglass shape, right? So if you have one paper as a spot in time, then the number of papers citing this kind of increases in kind of like an hourglass shape, and the same backwards. So if you then just get a few papers that are all from about the same time, then you might get blind spots between them. So you need to have a good selection of papers through time so that they are all overlapping and covering this entire field. I'm using the DOI, the digital object identifier, as the primary identifier because almost all scientific papers have one. My paper from 1860 doesn't, but most other ones do. Such an iterative expansion obviously grows very fast. It grows very fast, first order exponentially. Of course, there's a little bit of saturation, so it would be a JMAC behavior in reality. The question is always where in the JMAC curve you are in the end. Yeah, pretty easily get to tens of thousands of papers. I mean, if you are in a field that's much broader, it can be much quicker than that. We're talking about LLMs today. The foundational paper, the attention is all you need paper, has 200,000 citations. So if you just start with that one paper, you already have 200,000 other papers. And then what we get is what I call a citation Pareto front. So Pareto front usually in engineering is sort of a combination of optimal parameters between in multi-dimensional optimization. And in this case, it's publications versus citations. So how many times has a certain paper been cited? And what we get is this curve here that in theory should look a little bit more like this, but practice for this area, and this is hydrogen again, it looks more like this. And what that means is the new papers haven't been cited as much because they're new papers. And as the papers mature, as they get older, more and more people had a chance to cite those papers. And then apparently if they become very old, especially in this field, then they're not cited as much. So this is a logarithmic plot, by the way. And so essentially we can say that anything that's close to the Pareto front curve, these are the most influential papers because for their age, they've been cited the most. And so you can say, okay, I'm going to go and I'm going to measure my distance to the Pareto front as an indicator of the importance of that paper, and I just then sort by this. And this means I don't bias by age, so I don't just take old papers because they've been cited more, or I don't bias by things like what's the most current ones, because I say, okay, citations are not that important. And then I might have a field that there's a lot of publication in a certain period, then I would be biased to that. This really gives me a pretty good prioritization. And then why DOIs? It's because deduplication works pretty well. And it's a reliable provenance linking across metadata sources. So everyone knows what a DOI is, so you can always come with a DOI unless your paper is 150 years old. And this really enables our audit trail from agent query back to source paper. Okay, so I think you might just skip the metadata triage. So yeah, then can do things like look at constraints and see which ones you want to get first. But this is, I think, something the last slide already explained. Which brings us to the hard step, and this is collection. And I wish there was an easier way, but actually there's no single source that covers all the relevant literature. So there's no master repository that you can just go in and get all of the literature. And this is just field dependent. honestly, if you're in computer science, the archive is already pretty good. And you can download a lot of stuff from the archive, and you will find most of the literature there. For a lot of the more classical natural sciences, engineering sciences, no chance. Everything's owned by publishers, and you need to pay them a lot of money. And yeah, it's across publishers, repositories, formats, so everything's structured differently. Institutional access exists, so if you're at a university like me, you have access, but even we don't have access to everything because there is some more obscure journals that not as many people at my university might have an interest in, so the university is not going to pay a lot of money to have a subscription for those. And so the manual collection becomes the major bottleneck at 10,000 plus papers. So at our institute, we're about 60 people. So you can imagine how many PDFs someone has to download if you start spreading 100,000 papers across people. And well, that's what we have to do. So right now, my students all get lists of 500 DOIs that they need to download and dump into our server. And if everyone does 50 papers a day times 60 people, we're starting to get somewhere. Problem is, of course, in this case, rate limits. Of course, the publishers are not stupid. And they don't want their databases to be essentially duplicated somewhere else. And this is, after all, what we're doing here. We're not doing it illegally. It's fully within our right. But they are trying to make it as hard as possible for us. Some are worse. Some publishers, if I try to download 20 papers a day from them, then they will just give you an error and set your rate limit. Other publishers, you can just go and download 200 within a couple of minutes and they don't care. I don't know if they just haven't caught up with the times or whatever else the reason is. And this is what we call smurfing.
May I ask a question?
Yep.
There's no chance that you can automate that by agents or programs to download stuff. So you really have to do this by human, right?
More or less, yes. So every time I think I come up with a better version of automating that, it either becomes slower or you get kicked out immediately because the publishers might not spend a lot of effort making it easier for you to retrieve the data, but they certainly spend a lot of effort in trying to block people to automatically retrieve data. Yeah. Yep. Can you repeat that?
Have you taken a look at Zotero extensions, what they do to extract papers? I usually use it like this.
Yes, so the Zotero extensions, it depends on the publisher. So the Zotero extensions can extract everything automatically if it's on a server that supports that. But even there, you will hit rate limits. So it's not going to be any faster. But you can. Yeah. Yeah.
How about doing it illegally like the rest of us and just
If you're a private person, that's something I would not judge you for. If you work for a large university with liabilities, I would not do that. And the same if I would work for a company that can get sued, then that's maybe not a good idea to do.
Definitely don't talk about it in a talk, an official talk.
Yeah.
But the first question, where did you get the documents from? Well, no, you paid the subscription. I mean, you just got them from someone else.
Well,
Sign-up is easier than all those proxy rules you need to get legally
Yes.
from university.
but if the operation becomes large enough, then legal liability has become a problem.
That's the way all those LLMs get their data, actually.
The thing is, they don't. So most of the reason why when you ask an LLM specific questions about a scientific area where most of the literature is locked behind those paywalls, the answer is not going to be correct. And the reason for that is because they only scrape the parts of the internet that are accessible to them, and these informations are just not. This is why these days you probably see a lot of news on scientists using it for mathematical discovering and physics and so on. And the reason why this works so well is because physics and mathematics are very well rule-based, And a lot of those rules are accessible in books that are out of copyright, things like that. But if you're in a science that is not fully understood, and biological science is a very good example, but also experimental physics, engineering, and so on, nothing's fully understood. And this is not going to work because it's complex as it is, and it will only have part of the information. Okay, but this is what we call smurfing. You know, like if you're trying to cook meth and you have to send out people to buy cold medicine because you can't buy pseudoephedrine in bulk. That's what they call it, and we're just doing it for scientific literature. Okay, which brings us to the part where it starts getting fun, and this is the ingestion pipeline. So the core ingestion tasks is essentially the content extraction itself. So we either get native text, and everything I'm showing right now is actually native text extraction for the reason that for now it was just faster. But moving over to OCR, just because newer OCR models are just giving really good results in structuring. So far I've mostly used Mistral OCR, but recently, DeepSeek OCR v2 came out, which I think is pretty much on par with Mistral, and it's open weight, so you can run it on your own hardware. Works pretty okay on a 16 gigabyte VRAM graphics card. Then we need to get the metadata, if we have it. The next thing is that only about half or more of the papers have the even a DOI or any metadata embedded in the PDF. Which means we need to also have a way to extract the DOI either from the OCR or from the text or manually. So it's about a third of the papers where we really have to manually find the DOI, embed it ourselves, and then we can ingest it. Of course, the whole thing also comes with figure extractions, captions, and so on. Chunking, very important, because we need to have chunking in a very sensible way, yeah?
How do you deal with figures and with diagrams?
In the OCR or in the OCR? Well, it comes back in the JSON packets.
Just the picture then embedded as a...
Picture, so the image plus caption. And usually if you go into the vector database, you will use the caption for usually a dense embedding. No
multi-model embeddings?
No, the reason for that is that there is no really good multimodal embedding model for scientific data yet. Just not enough data out there. I mean, if as many people would have scientific graphs as they have images on Picasso or somewhere, we might have good embedding models, but they don't exist yet. They've been promised for years and years, but I haven't seen one yet.
I've seen only tutorials on how to train one, and then the data says like 10 figures or something.
Yeah, exactly. You would need a lot more than there is data probably in existence. Then, of course, chunking, summaries, and tag enrichment. This is the multi-tiered thing that I've been talking about, so that we have summaries, and then embedding and database ingestion, which sparse embedding, just regular sparse embedding and database ingestion. The summaries are very important because, I don't know if I talk about it, is because actually every scientific paper is supposed to have an abstract, but the reality is modern scientific papers don't have abstracts like in the meaning of the word abstract. And the reason for that is, again, for profit publishing, because if you look at papers from the 50s or 60s, you only needed to read the abstract and you knew everything, and that was it. And then the publishers figured out that nobody's going to buy the paper if all of the information is in the abstract. So they kind of pushed people towards taking the key findings out of the abstracts. So we need to go and build our own abstracts because the abstracts are not actually abstracts. And the RAG quality obviously depends strongly on the ingestion quality, and poor ingestion produces confident-sounding nonsense at retrieval time. But I have to say, especially since GPT-4o, the interpretation of the papers, even if there was significant PDF noise, is not actually that bad. And this is the core infrastructure actually. Of course, PDFs are not a database format, so we have heterogeneity problems. So we have native text PDFs with OCR, some of them with native text. Then we can have headers, we can have watermarks, we can have adverts, which is also kind of a nonsensical thing over the last couple of years that a couple of journals have adopted, that the first page of each paper you download is going to be an ad for something. And obviously we don't want to have that in our database. And front matter and noise, like running headers and so on and so forth. Multi-column layout sometimes can be a problem, especially if there's inserts, things like that. Again, OCR is getting much, much better in this case. Yeah. So Mistral is very good. DeepSeek OCR v2 is also pretty good by now. And so we mostly do native text extraction if available, OCR if not available, and a lot of the papers are hybrid, where if there is native text on a page, it will be extracted. If there is no native text, we do OCR, or where the native text is nonsensical. And this sort of deals with the heterogeneity of the PDFs. DOI resolution, I don't want to talk too much about that. So essentially, we also need to find out what the actual metadata of a scientific paper is, which on an individual paper level is actually relatively straightforward. Because worst case scenario, you just mark the title and Google it, and you will probably find a DOI. But doing that in an automated fashion for some tens of thousands of papers, not so easy. You try to recover as much as possible and do manually only as little as you need. DOI typically in about a third to half of the documents. Then you can find other metadatas maybe that you can use to resolve a DOI, which usually gets us up to about 2/3 of the articles, and then the rest is either you leave them out or you do it manually. Yeah? And especially in our institute, we have a lot of scans of old scientific research where you probably have to do it manually. This is just a couple of different ways or different identifiers that you can use. All right, then chunking. So chunking is the first thing where we really need to think about how to use it with an LLM. Reason for that is obviously that every LLM has a context window. And if whatever information you want to work on is larger than the context window, you're going to be out of luck. And even if you start hitting it very closely, I would say anything more than half the context window, you'll probably get context compactation at the worst of times. Usually at some point when you have a question where you actually need all of it, it will just be out of context and it will just compact everything. And for this, we have a hierarchical representation. So we have full text chunks, which is just a chunked version of the paper, ideally chunked in a way that is natural to the paper. So usually the papers we have consist out of an abstract, an introduction, materials and methods, results, discussion, conclusions. So if you can chunk by these, then you already made sure that you don't have too much overlap, semantic overlap between the individual chunks. Then I will have a long summary, typically 500-word summary, which is created by an LLM. A short summary, which is just a 50 or 100-word summary, so that I can fit a couple of thousand papers into context. And of course, we have metadata and tags for filtering and faceting. One of the main reasons for that is that whenever you do a semantic search has no cutoff. So if you can identify keywords, key phrases, or anything to pre-filter, the good thing about these is always they have a cutoff. Of course, we don't just rely on text alone. Compression is required at the overview scale, and the hierarchical design preserves the path back to the original evidence. Yeah, there was a question? Oh, okay, yeah.
Have you tried recursive language modeling here as well? Are
No.
those new or
No.
Not yet, or?
No, because we haven't trained models on the data at all. we've just used the data.
The recursive in terms of that that the model runs the code that can call the model inside this container, so say, and then for long, I can show it later, for long context documents, it should yield very good performance even with a normal sized model.
We'll talk about that later, because I don't think I know exactly what you're talking about. But what we definitely do is recursively go through the literature, through the chunks that we already have, and then pull sub-information for different agents so that we can span multiple context windows for each agent. This is what I've shown earlier with like the 10 sections, the 10 agents. Yeah, and this enables broad landscape queries, so we can see what's there in general while we deal with everything at the same time, and then focus in on certain aspects of it. So that the system can, for example, decide. You saw before that there was certain chapters, and I didn't tell the system what the chapters should be. It should be able to figure it out itself. So retrieval, this is also very, very important. So retrieval in this case is not just a semantic vector search. So semantic vector search is just the basis of it for a broad recall. But there's also BM25 lexical search, trigram matching, because very often we have specific materials with very specific names. So if you think about alloys for jet engines, for example, then there's not a whole lot of them, but there's very specific ones with very specific names. So you want to, and these names can have variations. So A718 is, for example, the alloy that all of the jet engines discs are made from. And there's different variants like A718 plus, A718, Alvac 718, God knows, but there's a whole lot of different variations of that. And so trigraphs allow you to search for that. And of course, metadata filtering and faceting, and all of the metadata then as ranking signals. So we talked before about citation counts, we talked about journal years, we talked about maybe also journal rank. So is this a very important journal, or has it been published in a less important journal? And this gives us then the strategy to recall, filter, re-rank, and this produces the evidence pack. So initially I was doing all of that semi-manually. So essentially I was creating weighing profiles. So you can see here the weighing is at a dense embedding. So this is for a literature review of current literature. So essentially the dense embedding is 0.8 weighted, then the sparse embedding, so BM25 is 0.2 weighted, citation count is weighted weekly, journal importance is weighted weekly, and age is weighted negatively. So if the papers are older, then they are downranked. Of course, you can make you can create such weighings for different things you want to know. Maybe you want to know the historic literature. Maybe you want to only know the papers that are very important, so that have been cited very much, and so on and so forth. And increasingly, actually, I let the agent do that. So that the agent, out of the context, needs to be able to find out how it should make the weighing for the search. So there is a couple of examples of what the weights could be. But then in the end, if the agent does the search, it will produce its own weighing. And it can also produce its own rewrite prompts and so on and so forth. Okay, so this is actually pretty much the state at which you could use this already as a pretty good database. But really the power comes in once you start connecting it to an agentic AI system via MCP. And so what MCP is, I think probably most of you know what MCP is. It's essentially a standardized protocol for LLMs to invoke tools and resources. So in LLM agent workflows, the agent can inspect collections, schemas, facets, documents, and chunks. So it knows what the database can do, and it can call the database in all kinds of different ways. It can do searches. It can do basic questions like getting individual queries, like getting in all the data from an individual publication and so on and so forth. The tool surface is inspectable and composable, not opaque. This is just what MCP is. It's a description for the LLM on how to call the tool. And this enables iterative evidence gathering. So essentially, what you needed to do before is you did a search, you produce an output from the search, and you gave that to the LLM and told it to do something. Yeah? But now what it can do is it can do multiple passes. So it can go in, it can do the search, do something with the search data, figure out, oh, maybe there is other topics in that field that I also need to consider, do another search, and so on and so forth, and really close the loop here. So right now in the V1 that I have, we can do semantic searches, get entire evidence packs, get facet counts for different properties, list the DOIs. It's very important because if you already have 20,000 papers and you want your students to download more, you want to check beforehand if you already have that paper. So just getting all of the DOIs is pretty important. Get document chunks and so on. Schemas so that the LLM knows what it can actually do. And server infos and so on. And so the workflow is now that the LLM, so the workflow for the LLM is now it can plan, it can do the tool calls, it can get the evidence, it can do the synthesis, and it can do a follow-up query. And what this enables in practice is that we have agentic workflows. So essentially, I give the LLM a question, which can be, or a task, which can be either I want to know something specific about something I'm working on right now, or I can say, this is a field I want to get into. Please give me a review of everything that's been done, what the important things are, and so on. And so we can get evidence for focused mechanistic questions. Very importantly, this is what I've been using it a lot, is contradiction mapping. So essentially, I want to work on something, and I want to know what does the literature say and where does the literature disagree, because this is where it's most interesting for us. Because maybe there's been a disagreement over years where people say this, other people say this, and you can think, hey, with my technique, I can actually give the answer and see what's actually the correct thing. Or maybe your agent finds out that there is a lot of disagreement, but I don't know, 3 years ago, someone did the experiment and they found out already. We can have something like literature discussion after drafting. So if I did some work that I want to publish, I can have it run. And have it check if what I say agrees or disagrees with the literature. And of course, it can write proposals much faster than you used before. And you can do briefing of students, so students can go in and ask the system a question. And I personally think this is what a university will look like in 5 or 10 years. Like an apprenticeship. You give the student things to do, and they need to query the knowledge by themselves. It's the exact other way the other way around that we do it right now. And this is just a example execution. This is in Codex, I believe, where I just understood. Okay, I want to review hydrogen effects of structural materials. Then it goes and does the search. It came up with a search query by itself. Then in this case, gather the top 30 publications, did some re-ranking, pulled another 30 publications, and so on. Okay, so the question is now, what are the limitations right now? Well, first of all, we don't have all of the literature. And this is a pretty obvious one. But also in the literature, so we don't have all of the literature because some of it needs to be ingested manually that we haven't done yet because maybe the metadata is there, but it's not there in the right way. And also we might have poor chunking from noisy PDF structures, which can be mitigated by OCR, but that's obviously a bit more expensive than just native text extraction. That we might have retrieval bias towards highly cited but less relevant papers, and that we might have translation artifacts from non-English papers, which I cannot actually guarantee it's not happening because I don't speak Japanese. So a lot of the papers that we look in are Japanese, for example. And from the native text extraction, very important for us is very often the math. We need to have the math correct, and in native text extraction, that's usually very rarely working out well. This is just something that I've randomly pulled out just this afternoon. This is from a paper from 2002. And if you look at the equations, there should be good LaTeX, but they are not. They're just gibberish. They don't make any sense. Whereas from OCR, from modern OCR systems, you usually get pretty good LaTeX. And most models actually speak math in LaTeX pretty well. I was especially astounded by Gemini 3.1 Pro. Came out last week. That does math actually really well. And if I can feed it the math from my field, it can do stuff on top of that. So safeguards, there's a bunch of those. So essentially we can have some fallbacks, some re-ranking, some filters, and so on. This is stuff that, it's just technical. So the question is, what is working now? What is next? So what is working now is already I can essentially outsource 80% of the knowledge work that I do with literature into an LLM. It can do a lot of that, and at a speed that I would never be able to do it, and at a scale that no human is able to do it. So in the beginning, I showed an example of a review of the whole hydrogen thing with 1,500 papers. A human is not able to do that. By now, we have about 5,000 of those papers in our system. No human is able to do that. So what are the near-term priorities? So better OCR quality. So right now, a lot of it's native text extraction because for the first iteration, I didn't want to spend a couple €100 on Mistral. I'm now ready to do that. We want better quality image linkage and image retrieval and so on. Also, of course, in the last couple of weeks, things like skills and plugins have been coming onto the scene. And very often, we have very defined things we want to do. So if you build a skill once, then you can just say, okay, build me a review paper for topic XYZ. Then it will already know what tools to use, how this should be structured, and so on and so forth. Possibly also depending on what length the whole thing has. I want to have better DOI resolution. So right now we have about 7,000 papers where we weren't able to retrieve the metadata. I will use students to resolve all of that if it comes to it, but if I don't need to, it would be nice. And I want to have more robust multilingual ingestion and translation handling, but this is not actually that hard. So essentially improve the ingestion quality, retrieval, better agent UX, and then just scale the whole database. Scale it to as large as we can for our field. What is the long-term vision? The long-term vision is, I don't know who of you studied at FAU and knows what this is. Yeah, you know what this is on the left? This is the engineering library, right? So I want to have the entire engineering library, at least anything that is relevant for me, in my vector database, and then accessible for my AI tools. So I estimate 100 to 200,000 papers for my immediate field. Then everything would be covered. Of course, whenever I start something new, we'll have to get that as well. I want to extend the teaching workflow. Some of them has already happened. So essentially that I can just take my lectures as I've given them and press a button and it will create the lecture script for it. This is already working pretty well for anything that doesn't use images from textbooks. But this is certainly also something to be expanded. Then standardized evidence synthesis patterns for proposal, review, and planning. So essentially that all those skills are built, pre-built, and you only need to say what you want right now. And to keep the system auditable, DOI-centric, and reproducible as it scales. As it scales, maybe also beyond traditional literature. Because one thing that I personally find very interesting is We have a lot of literature that is very well reviewed, but I also want to know all of the blind spots, all of the master thesis, PhD thesis, everything that's been forgotten, and be able to go into that as well. And the strategic value is not only faster reading, but it gives us better scientific decisions, and it gives us better scientific experiments if you're an experimentalist, because you can know exactly which questions are open and what the impact is going to be of what you're doing. Okay, and with that, I just want to finish up. So the final takeaways is we have now an end-to-end pipeline, not just chatbot retrieval. We have DOI, provenance, and quality, which is foundational. We have the RAG with the metadata, the validation, the ranking, and not just the embeddings, but also really domain-specific functionality. And this is already an infrastructure for better research strategy. And here on the right, obviously, you can't read that. It was just to show that this is essentially a question that I've just answered earlier, where I've said, okay, tell me everything about hydrogen exposure and fatigue crack growth. It was not actually my question, but from my colleague that I wanted to show the system to. And then it essentially explained everything that's in the literature, which is fully correct. And it's not just fully correct, but it's also fully traceable by all the literature that backs that up. And this is essentially what we want to have. Okay, and since I'm already a little bit over, I can skip the demo maybe. If you have a very specific question about a scientific topic, we can run it through Codex or Claude Code afterwards, and you can watch it happen.
Okay, I don't know, yeah, you can hear me. Thanks so much, Peter. We have time for maybe a couple of questions, but I would be interested in seeing the demo. Who would be? Maybe raise your hands if you want to see the demo.
Okay. So this is just in Codex. This is the output from before, where I was showing something to a different colleague of mine. So in this case, we were talking about superalloys and some specific crystal defect stuff in there. So essentially, because this is Codex and it doesn't have skills per se, I always need to tell it to use only the direct system as an MCP tool. I can show you the interface later. So a question about structural materials.
What is it?
What is it? This is a bit broad. So under specification is, I think, one of the worst things in AI, that people want to write a three-word prompt and get the world from it, right? So I need to be a bit more specific. I don't know.
You just mentioned the trivial search about various forms of your alloys for jet engines.
Yeah.
Can you query then, like, specification of the fracture limit for that alloy? When would it break? How much pressure can it stand to come out?
What is the tensile? We call that tensile strength.
Tensile strength.
What is the tensile strength of superalloys?
No, nothing specific. You have
Okay.
This
For material scientists, this is a very broad question, and if I would answer it, we'll probably be here until tomorrow morning. But let's see what Codex does. maybe it can be a little bit more concise than I would be.
One question from: do you have like a Claude MD or Agents MD where you specify like what it should do? Because maybe then you can skip these please only use that tool and don't have to type it every time.
Yes, in Codex it's a little bit different. So those skills typically exist in Claude Code. The problem with Claude Code is I burn through the tokens very quickly. So I need to get myself a max 20x subscription. I think right now I'm the pro plan. This is why with Codex it's usually okay. And I don't run out of tokens, but there you need to tell it again. Yeah.
How many tokens is this costing?
That is always a surprise. It will depend. It will depend. It's relatively efficient because behind a lot of the search functionality are Python scripts, so that doesn't cost any tokens. It will depend on how much it will retrieve. Because, of course, if the evidence pack is very large that it retrieves, so in this case for the super alloys, it probably got some review papers. In this case, that will have it summed up. So you can see here, room temperature polycrystalline nickel cobalt super alloys about 1.2 to 1.5 gigapascals. Iron nickel based examples about half a gigapascal to around that. And it says it correctly, very wide extremes depending on architecture. Because you would probably ask it a more specific question would be, for this specific alloy, tell me under which conditions we know the properties, and then show me the conditions and the properties and so on. Because this starts to be very broad. But so far it's correct. I would need to go and check what the individual papers are, but they're Scripter and Acta papers, so they're probably some relatively prominent papers.
So let's keep the questions maybe to like 5 or 10 minutes, because pizza is already there, and people tend to lose their focus when they smell the pizza. I have 2 questions from the chat. Maybe you can answer them briefly. Benny asks if you have a test data set to check RAG metrics like truthfulness or precisions or something like that, and how do you make sure that you have no hallucinations?
So the first thing I always do is to initially test everything with literature questions I would be able to competently answer without thinking about it. And check against that, check if it got the right papers for that. And this is really the first test, because after all, if you want to cross-check, you have to know those papers. When it comes to hallucinations, it's a little bit harder. So essentially hallucinations usually happen if you have something that's underspecified, if it needs to make something up. So if you fed it enough information, then it should not hallucinate. Is there any really good way for me to check that? So the only checks that I have at scale, if it's very small, it's 50 papers, I can read through it and I know if it's correct or not. It just saved me the work to do it. If it's 1,500 papers, no chance. So what I do is, this was also in some of the earlier prompts, it's multi-stage, so it essentially makes a draft and then rechecks everything based on the literature. Of course, this increases token burn significantly, but this is pretty much the only way you have, because manually checking 1,500 papers, it's a bit hard.
I have a question more of the experience design, just out of curiosity. Do you have something like a graph map network of the citations, like Obsidian, of the papers? Like, from my experience, I use Zotero and then connect it to the Obsidian. Then when I want to find relevant topics to one topic, I just have a visual overview of what to go for next. Just idea, or you already have implementation?
I have implemented that in MATLAB. So, yeah, so there's a citation graph implementation in MATLAB. I have not pushed it very far, because the problem in material science is it's very highly interconnected. So you get one very big ball of. So in other areas, maybe there are more prominent citation islands. At least for my area, because you combine measurement techniques with experimental techniques and with materials, then things just start to be very interconnected, and there isn't really these citation islands that you're able to make out, at least not to an extent that was helpful to me. So filtering turned out to be a lot more productive than trying to go by citation graphs.
Did you have a question? No, you had a question. Okay.
Super cool talk, and like the whole pipeline seems extremely involved. Like, it's quite a complex RAG system. So my question is more around, that's not the main part of what you or your lab might be doing. It's kind of like support software for what you do.
Yeah.
So how did you think about, well, how much time do we allocate to this? Who builds it? So more like nothing to do with the talk itself, that was amazing, but more in terms of how did you decide to build something like this? Clearly it's very useful, but justifying it at the start is probably, or was difficult, saying, hey, what is this? Are we IT or are we doing, stuff that we need?
It started with a very concrete problem set, and that is, so I'm the speaker or the main person behind a large-scale research proposal in an area that, well, you probably guessed what the area is by now, that just contains thousands of papers, and you need to essentially have a full overview of those if you go and ask for, in this case, somewhere into the tune of 50 million euros research money. This is just something that's not humanly possible. And depending on what reviewers you get for that research proposal, they might pull out this one paper that says, hey, but we've already done that 20 years ago. And you go like, yes, sorry, I didn't read your paper, which is a very, very bad thing to happen. And so it was really born out of necessity. In terms of building the system, it's been built by me alone. Yeah? It was just essentially driven by the need for the outcome. And that's it. Of course, in my research group in my institute, then the involvement of other people was collecting the literature, and this is if you go by man hours, this is where most of it goes.
One more question from the chat: whether you use or whether you translate text before you embed it, or if you use multilingual embedding models.
No, you use English-only embedding models, so it's being translated before it's being embedded.
Okay, yeah, cool. Maybe a final question, if we have it.
So it's OpenAI.
Okay, we do like 2 questions, and so you and then you.
Thank you. In another slide, you showed some weights you put on, I don't know, for example, citations. Is it only for the LLM to know how to weigh it, or do you actually calculate some measures here?
This is so you can't really calculate it, as it's more of a preference thing. There's no hard values that you can deduce for something specific. But over a lot of searches, you start fine-tuning everything, and eventually there's a list now of a bunch of profiles, about a dozen profiles for specific use cases, and the LLM can check those out and can change the weights accordingly if it feels the need to, because they are part of the semantic search invocation, or of the search invocation.
How is the hierarchy implemented in the database? Is it like different stores for different types of, I think in different slides there were different types of summaries, or is it like a single one with tags, or?
I can show you.
Yeah.
So this is the QRAN store that I'm using for that. It's in a Docker container on my computer. So we're going to deploy it soon on one of our servers. And it's just, so this is the current one. You can see it's about 350,000 points in there. Apart from that, it's completely flat. Probably in the future, it would be, because I built that before the database has grown, I think now it would be better to actually have the summary tiers in different collections. No, because usually you would start hierarchically, so you know that you can only search in one collection. This would speed things up. But with 300,000 points, it's still pretty quick.
Okay, thank you, Peter, and give a warm applause for our speaker.